The brass-handled doors of the Gilded Spoon were a portal to another time. Polished to a blinding sheen each morning, they opened into a living, breathing piece of Boston's history. Inside, the air hummed with a quiet dignity, a mixture of old leather, beeswax, and the rich aroma of the day's simmering stock. Dark mahogany walls were adorned with oil paintings of stern-faced founders, and sunlight was softened by heavy forest green velvet curtains, casting an intimate twilight over the starched white tablecloths. For 80 years, the Gilded Spoon had been a sanctuary for the city's old guard, judges, surgeons, and tenured professors who valued tradition over trend. For Clara Mae Thompson, it was the place where her dreams were either going to be paid for or die trying. Each shift was a grueling 12-hour marathon of balancing heavy trays and maintaining a posture of serene deference, no matter how much her feet ached. Every dollar she earned was a drop in the cavernous bucket of her nursing school tuition. Her goal was specific, born from caring for her beloved grandmother in her final years. She wanted to be a geriatric nurse. The Gilded Spoon, with its predominantly elderly clientele, felt like a premature training ground where she learned to listen patiently to meandering stories, seeing not just customers, but the very people she hoped to one day care for with professional compassion. This noble ambition was entirely at odds with the restaurant's new philosophy, embodied by Julian Croft. As the grandson of the revered founder, Alistair Croft, Julian saw the Gilded Spoon not as a legacy, but as an underperforming asset. With an MBA that preached disruption, he saw the loyal, elderly patrons as a demographic with low spending and zero Instagram presence, speaking in a jargon-laced dialect of optimizing revenue streams and curating a next-gen dining experience. His latest crusade was against the menu's most iconic item, the New England clam chowder. It was Alistair Croft's original recipe, a creamy, hearty concoction that had warmed Boston's elite for generations. Julian despised it, calling it stodgy and uninspired. He was actively trying to phase it out for a rotating menu of artisanal broths that left regular customers confused. The chowder became a quiet symbol of the battle for the restaurant's soul, a battle Clara felt every time Julian walked the floor with his tablet, his thin lips curved in a sneer of disapproval. For the past several months, a new face had joined the regulars. He was an old man, impossibly thin and slightly stooped, with a cloud of snowy white hair. His eyes, a pale, watery blue, held a profound weariness. He wore the same tweed overcoat every day, a once magnificent garment now frayed at the cuffs and shiny at the elbows. Arriving after the lunch rush, he would take the smallest, most secluded table and never order a meal, asking only for a glass of water. For an hour or two, he would just watch the dining room with an unreadable expression tinged with sadness. The other staff, taking their cues from Julian's bottom-line obsession, ignored him. To them, he was a camper, a non-revenue-generating body taking up valuable real estate. They would refill his water with a sigh, avoid his corner of the room, and whisper about him in the kitchen. But Clara saw something different. She saw the slight tremor in the hand that lifted the water glass. She saw the way he'd close his eyes when the scent of the chowder drifted from the kitchen, as if inhaling a memory. He reminded her so viscerally of her grandfather in his last days, a man whose world had shrunk to the size of a single room, a silent observer on the periphery of life. Clara made a point of being kind. She would bring him his water with a genuine smile. "Good afternoon, sir. It's nice to see you again," she'd say. She'd bring him a fresh napkin if his looked crumpled, or quietly remove the bread basket from the empty table next to his and place it on his own, just in case. He rarely spoke more than a soft, "Thank you," his voice a dry whisper, but his eyes would convey a gratitude so immense it felt like a physical warmth. Theirs was a silent communion, a small island of quiet decency in Julian Croft's churning sea of ambition. Julian, of course, noticed. "Thompson," he said one afternoon, cornering her by the service station, his voice a low hiss. "Who is the fossil in table 42? "He's just a gentleman who comes in to rest, Mr. Croft," Clara replied, keeping her voice even. "He's a vagrant," Julian snapped. "This isn't a public library. Look at his coat. He's bad for the brand. From now on, he gets water, and that's it. If he stays longer than 30 minutes, You politely inform him the table is reserved. We need turnover, not charity cases. Are we clear? Yes, Mr. Croft, Clara said, her jaw tight, but in her heart a quiet rebellion was brewing. The old man wasn't a liability. He was a reminder of what the restaurant was supposed to be, a place of comfort and respite. He was a piece of the old soul Julian was so desperate to excise. The last Tuesday in October blew in with a bitter North Atlantic fury. A cold, relentless rain hammered against the tall, arched windows of the Gilded Spoon, the sky a uniform, miserable gray. The wind howled through the city's canyons, rattling the window panes and sending a draft through the dining room that even the grand old fireplace couldn't fully vanquish. It was the kind of day that chilled you to the bone, a day made for hot soup and quiet contemplation. The lunch service was a nightmare. The foul weather had made the customers irritable and demanding. Julian was in a particularly venomous mood, stalking the floor, his tablet in hand, pointing out microscopic flaws, a fork misaligned by a centimeter, a water glass with a faint smudge, a server's smile he deemed insufficiently enthusiastic. His presence was a storm cloud within the storm, a crackling with oppressive energy. At 2 o'clock, just as the chaos began to subside, the old man came in. He looked worse than Clara had ever seen him. His threadbare coat was soaked through, plastered to his skeletal frame. He was shivering, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook his entire body. His face was ashen, and his pale blue eyes seemed clouded over with a fog of cold and exhaustion. He shuffled to his corner table and collapsed into the chair, his breath coming in ragged, shallow puffs. He looked not just weary or lonely today, he looked genuinely unwell. Clara watched him from across the room, her heart constricting in a knot of helpless empathy. He wrapped his thin arms around himself, trying to generate some warmth, but it was a futile effort. The other servers pointedly ignored him, busy with their end-of-lunch side work. Julian was in his glass-walled office overlooking the dining room, hunched over spreadsheets, a scowl etched on his face. The rich, savory scent of the clam chowder wafted from the kitchen. A large tureen of it was still simmering on the warmer. Julian's policy was draconian. Any unsold specials were to be discarded at the end of the lunch service. Not donated, not offered to staff. Discarded. It was a waste he justified as maintaining brand exclusivity. That chowder, a symbol of everything the restaurant once stood for, was destined for the garbage. In that moment, something inside Clara snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, decisive click. The image of the shivering old man, the thought of her own grandmother feeling that same deep, penetrating cold, and the sheer, soulless waste of pouring perfectly good, life-affirming food down the drain. It all converged into a single, undeniable imperative. Julian's policies, the profit margins, the threat to her own precarious job, it all faded into the background, eclipsed by a simple, profound human impulse. Her hands moved with a will of their own. She grabbed one of the heavy ceramic soup bowls, not the smaller, cheaper ones used for the staff meal. She ladled it full of the steaming, fragrant chowder, the steam rising in a comforting cloud. She took a linen napkin, a polished spoon, and a small plate with 2 packets of oyster crackers. Then, with her heart hammering against her ribs, she walked out of the service area and crossed the dining room floor. She moved with a quiet purpose that drew the attention of the few remaining diners. They watched her, curious. From his office, Julian looked up from his spreadsheet, his eyes narrowing. Clara reached the corner table. The old man had his eyes closed, his head leaning back against the high-backed chair. He seemed to have shrunk into himself. "Sir," she said softly, her voice barely a tremor. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then locking onto her face. He saw the bowl in her hands and a flicker of confusion crossed his features. "I thought you might like this to warm up," she whispered, placing the bowl gently on the table before him. "It's on the house. Please eat." The old man stared at the bowl as if it were a holy relic. The rich, creamy scent rose to meet him. He looked from the soup to her face, and his pale blue eyes, for the first time in months, seemed to clear. A storm of emotions passed through them. Disbelief, suspicion, and then a dawning, heart-wrenching gratitude that made Clara's throat tighten. His trembling hands reached out, circling the warm ceramic. The simple heat seemed to transfer to him, steadying the tremor. With a shaking motion, he lifted the spoon, dipped it into the chowder, and brought it to his lips. He took a slow, deliberate taste. His eyes closed again, but this time it was not from exhaustion. A single tear escaped from the corner of his right eye and traced a path down his weathered, wrinkled cheek. It was a tear of memory, of comfort, of something lost and unexpectedly found. He took another spoonful and then another. A hint of color returned to his ashen cheeks. He looked up at Clara, his mouth open as if to speak, but no words came. He simply gave her a small, profound nod, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 words of thanks. A warmth spread through Clara's chest, a feeling of rightness so pure and powerful it almost made her dizzy. She had done the right thing. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" The voice was a whip crack, slicing through the quiet sanctity of the moment. Julian Croft stood 10 feet away, his face a mask of incandescent fury. He had stormed out of his office, his tablet clutched in his hand like a weapon. Every head in the dining room snapped towards him. "Mr. Croft, Clara began, her voice faltering. "Don't you Mr. Croft me, Thompson," he snarled, closing the distance between them. He kept his voice low, but it was venomous, trembling with rage. "Did you process a payment for that item? Did you run a check for table 42? "No, but it was the end of lunch. It was going to be thrown out," she pleaded, her voice a whisper. He was so cold. "It is not thrown out until I say it's thrown out," Julian seethed, his face now inches from hers. "Until that moment, it is company inventory. It is an asset, and you stole it. You stole a $12 asset and gave it to a worthless freeloader." He gestured contemptuously at the old man, who had frozen, the spoon halfway to his mouth, his eyes wide with alarm and horror. "I didn't steal anything," Clara said, her own anger finally rising to meet her fear. "It was an act of decency. This is what this restaurant is supposed to be about." "Decency?" Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh that was devoid of any humor. "Decency is a liability. Decency doesn't get you a 5-star review on Yelp. It doesn't attract the tech bro crowd with their corporate cards. It just attracts that." He pointed again at the old man, who now looked as if he wished the floor would swallow him whole. "I have warned you," Julian continued, his voice rising in volume and pitch, becoming a performative declaration for the entire room. "I told you not to engage with him. You have willfully, flagrantly, and moronically violated company policy on inventory management, customer engagement, and basic financial protocols." "It was a bowl of soup," she shot back, her voice trembling with disbelief at the sheer, petty tyranny of it all. Julian's eyes narrowed to slits. He seemed to savor the moment, the absolute crushing power he held over her. He straightened his tie, smoothed his suit jacket, and took a half-step back, assuming an air of cold, formal authority. "Clara May Thompson," he announced, his voice now booming through the silent dining room. "As the managing director of this establishment, I am terminating your employment, effective immediately. Your tenure here is over. The reason for dismissal will be logged as a theft of company property and gross insubordination." The words hit her like a physical blow. Fired. The room seemed to tilt, the faces of the other diners blurring into a smudge of silent judgment. She could see her co-workers in the service station, frozen in place, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. In the corner, the old man looked utterly stricken, as if he, personally, had brought this catastrophe upon her. A wave of humiliation, hot and suffocating, washed over her. Her mind, a panicked calculator, began tallying the disasters. Tuition payment next month, rent due in 10 days, textbooks for her pharmacology class. "You can't be serious," she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a cold dread. "I have never been more serious in my life," Julian said, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "Your final paycheck, less the $12 cost of the stolen chowder, will be mailed to you. Now, collect your things from your locker and vacate the premises. You have 5 minutes before I call security to have you escorted out as a trespasser." He turned his back on her, dismissing her with a finality that was as brutal as it was absolute. He was not just an employer firing an employee, he was a king banishing a peasant from his realm. Numbly, her body moving on autopilot, Clara walked toward the staff room in the back. She could feel every eye in the room on her back, their stares like tiny daggers. She refused to give Julian the satisfaction of seeing her cry. She packed her small bag, her worn-out nursing textbooks feeling impossibly heavy. She walked back out, her head held high, forcing herself not to look at anyone. But as she approached the heavy brass doors, her gaze was involuntarily drawn to the corner table. The old man was on his feet, his face etched with anguish and distress. The half-eaten bowl of soup sat on the table, a testament to the kindness that had cost her everything. He took a hesitant step towards her, opening his mouth, a desperate apology forming on his lips. Clara gave him a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It wasn't his fault. It was Julian's. Then she pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the cold, unforgiving rain. The bell above the door chimed softly behind her, a funeral toll for her job and, it felt, for her future. The walk home was a 3-mile pilgrimage through a blur of rain and tears. The cold, which had seemed so brutal outside the restaurant's windows, was now an intimate enemy, seeping through her thin uniform, chilling her to the marrow. Each step was a squelch of misery, a rhythmic reminder of her sudden, catastrophic unemployment. Julian's words echoed in her head, a cruel looping chorus. Theft. Gross insubordination. Vacate the premises. He had branded her a thief for a bowl of soup destined for the trash. The injustice of it was so profound, it felt like a physical weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. But the absurdity of the charge was quickly overwhelmed by the terrifying reality of its consequences. A cold, hard knot of panic was tightening in her stomach, a familiar but now monstrously large presence. Her mind spun frantically, a vortex of impending financial doom. The tuition payment for her next semester was $4,800. She had managed to save just over half of that, a feat that had required monastic discipline and countless extra shifts. Her rent was $1,200 due in a week and a half. Her share of the utilities was another $200. Her final paycheck, even before Julian's petty deduction, would barely cover a fraction of it. And now she had no income. Worse, she had a black mark on her record. Who would hire a waitress fired for theft? The accusation, however ridiculous, would follow her, a toxic stain on every application. The city lights of Boston, usually a source of comfort and beauty, blurred into long, watery streaks. The warm, glowing windows of brownstones and cafes felt like personal insults, each one a tiny portrait of a life that was warm, stable, and secure. Her life, in the span of 5 minutes, had been detonated by a man whose ego was as fragile as his designer suits were expensive. She replayed the scene again and again, torturing herself. Was it just the soup, or was it something more? It was her defiance, she realized. It was her quiet, persistent kindness to the old man, an act that Julian saw as a personal affront to his new, sterile vision. She had chosen humanity over policy, compassion over profit. In Julian Croft's world, that was the ultimate sin. She had shown loyalty to a forgotten old man, a loyalty Julian demanded be reserved exclusively for his brand. An hour later, soaked and shivering, she finally reached the triple-decker in Dorchester she shared with 2 other students. The building, with its sagging porches and peeling paint, had never looked so grim. She trudged up the 3 flights of stairs, her legs aching, her spirit feeling utterly pulverized. She let herself into the apartment, dripping a puddle onto the worn welcome mat. Her roommate, Sarah, was at the kitchen table, surrounded by a mountain of anatomy textbooks. "Clara, you're home early," she said cheerfully. Then her smile faltered as she took in Clara's drenched and devastated appearance. "Oh my God, what happened? You look like you just walked through a hurricane." The question, so full of simple concern, broke the dam of composure Clara had so carefully constructed. The story came pouring out, punctuated by ragged sobs. Sarah listened, her expression shifting from confusion to righteous fury. "He fired you? Over a bowl of soup? That blazer-wearing, trust fund baby, sociopathic little..." Sarah let loose a string of creative insults that, in any other circumstance, would have made Clara laugh. That's not just unfair, Clara. That's monstrous. Sarah made her a cup of tea, wrapped her in a thick blanket, and sat with her on their lumpy sofa as Clara's shivering slowly subsided. The warmth and solidarity helped, but they couldn't touch the cold dread that had settled deep in her soul. Later that night, long after Sarah had gone to bed, Clara sat at the same kitchen table, the unpaid bills spread out before her like a tarot reading of a bleak and punishing future. The panic was no longer a knot. It was a living, breathing monster with its claws wrapped around her throat. She opened her laptop, the screen's harsh glare illuminating her tear-streaked face. She navigated to the university's financial aid portal. She looked up the policy for dropping out mid-semester. She scrolled through job search websites, her heart sinking with each click. Waitress, barista, hostess. Each listing felt like a step backward, and the question on every application loomed. Reason for leaving previous employment. How could she possibly explain? She thought of the old man. She hoped he was warm. She hoped he had finished his soup before Julian had ruined everything. A bitter, resentful thought, unwelcome but persistent, crept into her mind. Why did my life have to implode over him? He would go on with his quiet, lonely life, and she was left to sift through the wreckage of hers. It wasn't his fault. She knew that intellectually. The fault lay squarely with Julian. But in the dark, lonely hours of the night, when fear was the only companion, it was easier to feel a sliver of anger than the full, crushing weight of despair. She finally closed the laptop, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She looked at a framed photo on the shelf beside the table, a picture of her and her grandmother, taken years ago. Her grandmother was smiling, her eyes full of pride. It was for her, for the memory of her gentle strength, that Clara was doing all this. "I'm sorry, Grandma," she whispered to the photo. "I don't know if I can do this." Sleep offered no escape. She tossed and turned, her mind a relentless slideshow of worst-case scenarios, eviction notices, calls from the bursar's office, the shame of having to tell her parents she had failed. She drifted into a restless doze, only to be jolted awake by nightmares of Julian Croft laughing as she fell from a great height. The morning arrived gray and oppressive, a perfect mirror of her mood. The rain had stopped, but a damp, clinging mist shrouded the city. Clara moved through the morning rituals like a ghost, showering, dressing, forcing down a piece of dry toast. She had an important exam in her clinical skills class that afternoon, but the complex terminology and procedures she had painstakingly memorized now felt like a foreign language. How could she focus on calculating IV drip rates when she couldn't even figure out how she was going to pay her rent? Returning to the silent apartment after dropping Sarah at her morning class, the weight of her unemployment pressed down on her, suffocating her. She spent the morning in a frantic, dispiriting cycle, tweaking her resume, trying to phrase her dismissal in a way that sounded less damning. Left to pursue other opportunities, a bitter lie. Corporate restructuring, a laughable exaggeration. Each attempt felt more hopeless than the last. Around 11 o'clock, a sound from the street below broke her concentration. It wasn't the usual rumble of the city bus or the whine of a passing ambulance. It was a low, powerful purr, the sound of a high-performance engine, utterly alien to their humble working-class street. She moved to the window and peered down. Her breath caught in her throat. Parked directly in front of her building, double-parked and occupying the space with an unapologetic arrogance, was a limousine. Not a stretched-out party limo, but a stately obsidian-black sedan, the kind that ferries diplomats and CEOs. It gleamed under the gray sky, its tinted windows reflecting the drab triple-deckers like polished mirrors. It was so profoundly out of place, it might as well have been a spaceship. Old Mr. Henderson from the first floor was on his porch, staring, his morning paper forgotten in his lap. A group of kids on their way to the park stopped and pointed. Clara's first thought was that they had the wrong address. Her second, a jolt of pure, undiluted panic, was that it was some kind of bizarre, high-end debt collector. Had she defaulted on a student loan she'd forgotten about? The thought was absurd, but her mind was already primed for catastrophe. She watched, frozen, as the rear door opened with a quiet, hydraulic hiss. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, tall and slender, dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a silver tie. He carried a sleek, dark leather briefcase. His graying hair was impeccably styled, and he moved with a calm, confident air of someone who billed their time in 6-minute increments and was never, ever late. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the front of her building before seeming to land directly on her third-floor window. Clara instinctively jumped back, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A moment later, a sharp, authoritative rap echoed from her apartment door. It wasn't the casual knock of a friend or the thud of a delivery person. It was precise, insistent, and utterly unnerving. She stood paralyzed in her living room, her mind racing. Who was he? What could he possibly want? Maybe if she stayed quiet, he would think no one was home and leave. But the knock came again, louder this time, more demanding. It was the knock of someone who knew she was there and was prepared to wait. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she crept to the door and peered through the peephole. The distorted fisheye lens showed the man in the suit standing patiently in the shabby hallway, his polished shoes looking absurdly out of place on the scuffed linoleum. He wasn't going anywhere. Her hand trembled as she slid the deadbolt open. She opened the door just a crack, leaving the security chain engaged. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice a reedy whisper. The man's expression was professional, not unkind but serious. "Are you Ms. Clara May Thompson?" he asked, his voice smooth and measured. "Yes," she squeaked. "My name is Benjamin Carter. I'm an attorney." He held up a business card. Even through the crack, she could see the expensive, embossed lettering. "I represent a client who has asked me to speak with you regarding your dismissal from the Gilded Spoon yesterday. May I come in?" An attorney. The panic returned, tenfold and ice cold. She was being sued. The restaurant was suing her for the stolen chowder. Julian was pressing charges. It was insane, a dystopian fantasy. But then, so was everything else that had happened. I don't understand," she stammered. "I can't afford a lawyer. I haven't done anything wrong." "You are not in any trouble, Miss Thompson, I assure you," Mr. Carter said calmly, seeming to read the terror on her face. "Quite the opposite, in fact. My client has a business proposition for you. It concerns the events of yesterday afternoon." Clara stared at him, bewildered. A business proposition? The only person she had interacted with besides Julian was the old man. The idea that he was behind this was preposterous. A man in a frayed coat who couldn't afford a cup of tea did not have a high-powered lawyer and a limousine on retainer. It made no sense. "I'm sorry, I'm just very confused," she said. "That's perfectly understandable," the lawyer replied with practiced patience. "It would be much easier to explain if you would be willing to accompany me. My client wishes to meet with you in person. He is waiting." "Accompany you where?" she asked, her suspicion mounting. "Back to the Gilded Spoon," he said. The suggestion was so bizarre, so utterly unthinkable, that Clara almost laughed. Go back to the scene of her deepest humiliation? The place where she had been publicly branded a thief and cast out like garbage? "Absolutely not," she said, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "Why on earth would I ever go back there?" "Because, Ms. Thompson," Mr. Carter said, his gaze steady and serious, "my client believes a grave injustice has been done, and he is in a unique, and I dare say singular position to rectify it. I can promise you it will be very much worth your while." He slid his business card through the crack in the door. It landed softly on the floor. "My client is a very private man, but he is also a very determined one. We will wait in the car for 15 minutes. If you decide to join us, we can resolve this matter today. If not, I will respect your decision, but you may be forgoing a significant opportunity." With that, he gave a slight nod, turned, and walked back down the hallway. Clara watched through the peephole as he descended the stairs and got back into the waiting limousine. The door closed with a barely audible click, sealing him back inside his world of silent luxury. She stood there, her mind a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a tiny flickering spark of wild curiosity. Every rational instinct screamed at her to lock the door, bolt it, and hide. This had to be a trick, a cruel, elaborate joke orchestrated by Julian to humiliate her further. But then she looked at the expensive, embossed card on her floor. She looked at the bills on her kitchen table. She thought of her grandmother's proud smile. What was the worst that could happen? More humiliation? She had already hit rock bottom yesterday. At least this time, she'd be walking in, not being thrown out. And what if? What if, by some 1,000,000 to 1 chance, this was real? What if this impeccably dressed lawyer held the only lifeline she had? With a surge of adrenaline-fueled resolve that felt like jumping off a cliff, she unlatched the security chain. She had 15 minutes to change her life. Clara's hands shook as she threw on the nicest outfit she owned, a simple pair of black slacks and a clean, but slightly faded navy blue blouse. It was the outfit she wore for scholarship interviews, a thin armor of respectability. She ran a brush through her hair and stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. The same tired, worried face stared back at her, but there was a new, wild uncertainty in her eyes. This was either the smartest or the most profoundly foolish decision of her life. Walking out of her building and towards the gleaming black limousine felt like stepping onto a movie set. Mr. Henderson was still on his porch, his mouth slightly agape. The neighborhood kids had been joined by a few curious adults, all watching in silent, open speculation. Mr. Carter stepped out and opened the rear door for her with a polite, deferential nod. The interior of the car was another world. The scent of rich leather and polished wood filled the air. The seats were plush and deep, and the cabin was so utterly silent that the noise of the city completely vanished, replaced by a low, contented hum. It was the kind of opulent luxury Clara had only ever seen in magazines, a hermetically sealed capsule of wealth and power. The ride downtown was short and conducted in a tense silence. Mr. Carter sat opposite her, occasionally glancing at his phone, but he offered no further information, and Clara's mind was too crowded with chaotic speculation to form a coherent question. Who was this mysterious client? A wealthy patron who had witnessed the scene and felt sorry for her? A rival of Julian's looking for leverage? The old man still flickered at the edge of her thoughts, a persistent but impossible possibility. As they turned the final corner onto the familiar tree-lined street, her stomach lurched. There it was, the Gilded Spoon. But the scene outside was anything but familiar. Parked directly in front of the brass doors was another identical black limousine. Standing on the sidewalk, deep in conversation, were 2 other figures. One was another lawyerly type, a sharp-looking woman in a dark business suit holding a tablet. The other made Clara's heart stop cold. It was the old man, but it wasn't. He stood taller, straighter, the frail, stooped posture completely gone. The frayed tweed overcoat was nowhere in sight. Instead, he wore a magnificent, perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit that fit his frame with an understated elegance that screamed old money. His snowy white hair and beard were still neatly trimmed, but they now seemed less a sign of age and more a mark of distinction, like a retired statesman. His previous air of weary vulnerability had vanished, replaced by an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. He looked from the restaurant's doors to their approaching car, and his pale blue eyes, no longer watery or clouded, were clear, intelligent, and piercing. The transformation was so staggering, so utterly absolute, that Clara felt a wave of dizziness. This was impossible. It defied all logic. Her lawyer, Mr. Carter, seemed to notice her shock. "Allow me to formally introduce you to my client, Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice calm as their limousine glided to a stop behind the first. "Mr. Alistair Croft." The name hit her like a thunderclap. Croft, the founder, the patriarch, the man whose portrait hung in the restaurant's foyer, a younger, darker-haired version of the man now standing on the sidewalk. Julian's grandfather. Mr. Carter opened her door and she stepped out onto the sidewalk, her legs feeling like jelly. Alistair Croft ended his conversation and turned to face her. His gaze met hers, and in his eyes she saw not a stranger, but the same man from the corner table. The sadness was still there, deep in their depths, but now it was tempered by a profound strength and a hint of a gentle, apologetic smile. "Miss Thompson," he said. His voice was not the dry whisper she remembered, but a low, resonant baritone, rich with a lifetime of command. "Thank you for coming. I apologize for the theatricality of all this, but I felt a certain statement was necessary. He gestured to the woman beside him. Please, allow me to introduce my lead counsel, Jessica Davies. And this is my personal physician, Dr. Eris Thorne, he added, nodding to a distinguished-looking man who had just exited the first limo. They have been assisting me in a personal project these last few months? Clara couldn't speak. She could only stare, her mind struggling to reconcile the shivering, destitute man from yesterday with the powerful, composed figure standing before her. I don't understand, she finally managed to say, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. You're Alistair Croft? A flicker of the familiar sadness crossed his face. I am a man who has spent the last 6 months trying to see the world not as Alistair Croft, the founder, but simply as Alistair, the old man, he explained. After my son Edward passed away and my grandson took over, I became concerned about the direction in which he was taking my legacy. Julian believed I was past my prime, out of touch. He and the new board members he appointed effectively pushed me out. So I decided to see for myself what had become of my restaurant, from the outside in. He took a step closer, his eyes holding hers. I wanted to see if the principles on which I built this place, dignity, respect, and simple human kindness, still existed within its walls. For months, I found only indifference, impatience. I saw a staff ruled by fear and a clientele treated as numbers on a spreadsheet. He paused and his expression softened. Until I started watching you. I saw you day after day treating every customer, especially the oldest and most difficult ones, with a grace and patience that my own son would have admired. And then yesterday you saw a cold old man and you didn't see a liability. You saw a human being. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as the full, earth-shattering weight of the situation crashed down upon her. This was real. For that simple act of compassion, Alistair finished, his voice now turning to cold steel as he looked past her, towards the brass doors of the restaurant. You were humiliated and punished by a boy who has mistaken cruelty for strength. That is an outcome I find entirely and personally unacceptable. Shall we go inside? I believe my grandson is about to have a very educational morning. The bell above the door of the Gilded Spoon chimed, the same soft musical sound that had signaled Clara's miserable exit the day before. This time, it announced an invading force. Julian Croft was standing near the host stand, berating a young busboy for leaving a single water spot on a wine glass. He looked up, annoyed by the interruption. His face went through a rapid, comical series of transformations. First, confusion as he saw Clara. Second, a surge of indignant rage. Finally, utter paralyzing shock as he registered the two impeccably dressed lawyers, the distinguished doctor and the imposing figure of his grandfather, Alistair Croft, flanking her like a royal guard. Grandfather? He sputtered, the name coming out as a choked gasp. What is the meaning of this? And what is she doing here? I fired her. She's trespassing. She is here as my guest, Julian, Alistair said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable weight of command. He walked slowly into the center of the dining room, his gaze sweeping over the space, not as a visitor, but as a king reclaiming his throne. The few lunch patrons fell silent, their forks hovering midair, sensing the unfolding drama. I have spent the better part of 3 months frequenting this establishment in a professional capacity, Alistair continued, his eyes locking onto his grandson's. I have sat in that corner and observed. I have observed your contempt for our oldest patrons. I have observed your obsession with fleeting trends over timeless quality. And I have observed your management style, which seems to be based on the principles of a 19th century prison warden. Julian's face, which had been pale with shock, now began to flush with a blotchy, defensive red. I don't know what you're talking about. I was upholding the standards of the brand. My brand. That woman, he pointed a trembling finger at Clara, was stealing. I fired her for cause. Ah, yes, the cause, Alistair said, a dangerous edge to his voice. A $12 bowl of my clam chowder, The recipe you've been trying to remove from the menu since the day you took over. Tell me, Julian, is there a policy against basic human kindness in your new brand manual? It was theft, Julian insisted, his voice growing shrill. The rules are the rules. Let's talk about rules and financials, shall we? Jessica Davies, the lead counsel, stepped forward, tapping her tablet. Mr. Croft's experience yesterday prompted us to initiate an immediate and thorough audit of this restaurant's financials and inventory logs. We've had a very busy night, Julian. She looked up from the tablet, her eyes as cold and sharp as shards of ice. We found a fascinating pattern, consistent discrepancies between your reported liquor costs and your actual inventory. It seems dozens of cases of high-end wine and scotch have been consistently written off as breakage or promotional comps. Yet strangely, there are no records of these promotions, and the breakage numbers are 500% higher than any other restaurant in the company's portfolio. Julian began to sweat profusely. That's clerical errors. Spoilage. This is a high-volume business. Is it? Ms. Davies continued relentlessly. Because our preliminary investigation, aided by a tip from the restaurant's very loyal head chef, who is appalled by your leadership, suggests that this spoilage has a habit of ending up at a certain wine auction house in Cambridge, sold through a private LLC that is registered to your personal assistant. It seems while you were terrorizing your staff over a bowl of soup, you've been systematically embezzling tens of thousands of dollars for months. The final nail was hammered into Julian's coffin. His blustering facade crumbled completely, replaced by pure, undisguised terror. He looked from the lawyer's tablet to his grandfather's unyielding face. There was no escape. This is a mistake. A misunderstanding, he whispered, clutching the host stand for support. No, Julian, Alistair said, his voice low and final. The mistake was my son's, for believing you shared his integrity. The mistake was mine, for allowing a culture to fester in my own restaurant where a man like you could thrive and a woman like Miss Thompson could be punished. That mistake, he declared, his voice rising to fill the silent room, is being corrected, right now. He turned to Mr. Carter. Benjamin, please inform the Board of Croft Enterprises, the real board, the one I convened this morning via my majority shareholder rights, that Julian Croft is terminated as managing director, effective immediately. Have security escort him off the premises, and please coordinate with the district attorney's office. I imagine they will be very interested in Ms. Davies' audit. Julian Croft looked at Clara, his eyes filled with a desperate, pleading hatred. He had been so powerful, so untouchable just yesterday. Now he was ruined, exposed by the very kindness he had sought to crush. He opened his mouth, perhaps to curse at her, to scream, but no words came. Two discreet but very large security men entered the restaurant and flanked him. Silently, they led the trembling, defeated young man away, his slick, modern world collapsing in on him. The dining room was deathly quiet. Alistair Croft turned his back on the scene of his grandson's demise and faced Clara. The hardness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a gentle, weary warmth. Now, Miss Thompson, he said softly, let's discuss your future. The heavy silence that descended upon the Gilded Spoon after Julian Croft's ignominious exit was thick with unspoken questions. The staff, who had witnessed the entire coup, stood frozen, looking at Clara as if she were a figure from a fairy tale who had just slain a dragon. The few remaining patrons were now openly staring, their lunch forgotten. Alistair Croft's stern, authoritative demeanor melted away, revealing the weary, kind-eyed man Clara had first known. He looked at her, still standing near the entrance, her mind a maelstrom of shock, vindication, and disbelief. Clara, he said, his voice now gentle, using her first name for the first time, would you join me for a moment? At my table. He gestured towards a small, secluded table in the back corner. Their corner. As if moving through a dream, Clara walked to the table and sank into the chair he held out for her. Her legs felt weak, her hands trembled in her lap. Mr. Carter and Miss Davies, ever the professionals, remained standing at a respectful distance, a silent testament to the gravity of the meeting. For a long moment, Alistair simply looked around the dining room, a wistful, melancholic expression on his face. My wife Eleanor and I had our first date in this room. 60 years ago, he began, his voice a low, reflective murmur. Right over there, table 7. I was a terrified young man with a foolish dream of opening a restaurant. She was the one who believed in me. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. She designed the interiors, chose the paintings. She said a restaurant should feel like a warm embrace, not a transaction. He turned his gaze back to Clara, his pale blue eyes holding a deep, resonant emotion. After she passed, and then my son, the world lost its color. All the money, all the success. It couldn't fill the silence. So I started coming back here, wearing my old coat, trying to find a trace of the world she and I had built. A world where a warm embrace still mattered. He sighed, a sound heavy with the weight of loneliness. For months, I found only what Julian was building, a cold, efficient machine, until yesterday. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Clara, what you did was more than just giving an old man a bowl of soup. In my world, gestures are calculated. Kindness is often a transaction, a prelude to a request. It has been a very long time since I encountered something so genuine, so freely given with no expectation of reward. You weren't just being kind, you were being brave. You risked your livelihood, the very thing that supports your dream of becoming a nurse, for a stranger. You honored my wife's memory without ever knowing her. Clara finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. I was just trying to do the right thing. It's what my grandmother would have done. That, Alistair said, his voice firm with conviction, is precisely the point. You did it because you are Clara May Thompson, a woman of character and compassion. Not because you thought I was Alistair Croft, the billionaire. He sat back, his expression shifting from reflective to resolute. Which is why I cannot simply offer you your old job back. That would be an insult to what you endured and a profound disservice to your potential. This place, he said, gesturing around the cafe, is fundamentally broken. It needs more than a new manager. It needs a new heart. It needs a leader who understands that profit and decency are not mutually exclusive. He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze steady and serious. The position of general manager of the Gilded Spoon is now vacant. I am offering it to you. The words hit Clara with the force of a physical impact. Manager? A wave of vertigo washed over her. Me? She stammered, a bewildered laugh escaping her lips. Mr. Croft, with all due respect, I don't have any experience. I've never managed anything besides my own checkbook, and I barely do that well. I wouldn't know the first thing about ordering, or payroll, or anything. Her self-doubt, her constant companion for years, rose up like a wall. You know how to treat people with respect. That is the first and most important qualification, he countered gently but firmly. I didn't just watch you yesterday, Clara. I've been watching you for months. The business acumen, the operational details. We will provide you with the best training money can buy. You will have a direct line to my personal team for support, anything you need. I am not looking for an MBA, Clara. I am looking for a moral compass. I have already found one. It was too much to process. Manager, a real salary, benefits, the ability to pay for her tuition without fear. The tears she had shed in despair the night before returned, but this time they were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable gratitude. But your dream, Alistair continued softly, as if reading her deepest thoughts. The reason you were working so hard in the first place, to become a nurse. Mr. Carter stepped forward and discreetly placed a handsome, dark green, leather-bound folder on the table. Alistair pushed it gently toward her. This is not just about the restaurant. This is about you. Her hands trembling, Clara opened it. Inside were official, notarized documents, thick and important. At the top of the first page, she saw the words, the Eleanor Croft Memorial Nursing Scholarship. Her eyes scanned the legal jargon, but the meaning was clear. It was a fully funded trust, established in his late wife's name, to provide a full scholarship to one deserving nursing student each year at her university. It covered tuition, books, fees, and a living stipend, ensuring the recipient could focus entirely on their studies. The inaugural recipient, it stated in crisp black ink, was Clara May Thompson. It was a guarantee, a promise of a future free from the financial burdens she had fought against her entire adult life. Seeing her name on that document, so official and permanent, was what finally broke her composure. A sob, raw and cathartic, escaped her lips. It was the sound of years of fear and anxiety finally being released, of a burden she thought she would carry forever, suddenly lifted from her shoulders. I don't know what to say, she wept, looking up at the man who had, in the span of a single day, appeared as both a destitute stranger and a guardian angel. This is too much. It is nothing less than what your integrity has earned, Alistair said, his own voice thick with emotion. Eleanor would have loved you. All I ask is that you accept both offers. Help me run this place with the heart it deserves while you finish your schooling. We will work around your class schedule. When you graduate, a management position will always be here for you, should you want it, but your dream comes first. Through her tears, Clara nodded vigorously, a radiant, watery smile breaking through. Yes, she whispered, the single word full of a lifetime of hope. Yes, of course. Thank you. Alistair stood, his work complete. My team will be in touch this afternoon to handle all the formalities. Run this place your way, Clara. Restore the chowder to its rightful place of honor. The keys are yours. With a final, meaningful nod to her, Alistair Croft and his team turned and left the restaurant. The bell tinkled softly one last time, signaling not an end, but a spectacular, impossible beginning. Clara remained at the corner table, her hands resting protectively on the folder that held her future. After a moment, the head chef, a large man named Miguel, whom Julian had constantly terrorized, approached her table. Miss Thompson, manager? He asked, a wide grin spreading across his face. What are your orders? Clara looked up at him, and for the first time she saw not just a co-worker, but her team. She took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and felt a new, unfamiliar confidence settle over her. Miguel, she said, her voice clear and steady, why don't you start by making a fresh, very large batch of the original New England clam chowder? And tell the staff. Tell them we're closing for the rest of the day. Paid, of course. We'll reopen tomorrow with a clean slate. She stood up and walked behind the host stand, the space feeling both foreign and like home. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from Sarah. How did the exam go? Clara smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes and transformed her face. She had completely forgotten about the exam. It didn't matter. Nothing could stop her now. She typed back a reply, her fingers flying across the screen. Skip the exam. Long story, but I can tell you this. Tuition is paid for. All of it. And I think I just got a new job. She hit send, and as she looked out the grand, arched window of her restaurant at the city that had once seemed so cold and unforgiving, she didn't feel small or scared anymore. She felt like she belonged. And in the warm, quiet heart of the Gilded Spoon, she knew she was finally home.